First of all, very warm welcome to this second edition of the Brics Economic Conclave, which was actually introduced during the 2016 Brics Chairship of India, which was physically held in Goa that time, and it was a 3-day event. But since this time it is happening virtually, we had to scale it down. But the participation yesterday was fabulous. In terms of the panelist contribution, the participation from the floor. So we are very excited that this today's second day would be also equally exciting in terms of the deliberations and the questions from the floor. So before I hand over the mic to chair, let me introduce the chair. We have today two sessions. One on green finance, the other one is on digital economy. Both, as you know, are very contemporary issues, and a lot of opportunities and apprehensions exist in these two areas of financial sector. The first session, that is technical session 3, would be chaired by Professor Biswajit Banerjee. Professor Biswajit Banerjee is currently expert advisor to the governor of National Bank of Slovakia, and he has other hats to his credit. One, and he is also part of the Monetary Policy Committee of European Central Bank. He is a professor of economics at Ashoka University in India. He's also contributing to the finance pillar work program of RIS as Adjunct Senior Fellow. And before that, he has held several positions as Chief Economist of the at the Minister of Finance of Slovak Republic, and several other portfolios in at leadership positions. So with this brief introduction, I now invite Professor Banerjee to take over the rest of the proceedings of this session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Dash, and welcome to everybody, the panelists, the keynote speaker, the participants for this third technical session of the Brics Economic Conclave. And the topic is green finance, which is almost synonymous, is used as sustainable finance. So we have as the keynote speaker, very eminent personality, Sir Danny Alexander, who is Vice President, Policy and Strategy of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And we have three distinguished panelists, Professor Carlos Eduardo Frickman-Young of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Dr. Saurabh Ghosh, Director, Strategic Research Unit of the Reserve Bank of India in Mumbai, and Mr. Rajiv Mahajan, Manager of the Project Finance Private Sector Facility Green Climate Fund from Seoul, Korea. So welcome to everybody. Before I call upon Sadani to make his address, I would like to say brief remarks, setting the stage for what I would see as three key areas where it's very important to get clarity and to have a sense of direction. And I would like the panelists, when they speak, to address some of these considerations in addition to other important points that they might have. So now the disastrous consequences of climate change are plainly evident across the globe. And arresting climate change has now become a priority, and achieving this goal over the next few decades requires substantial structural transformation. The central challenge is one of capital reallocation, not only scaling up green or sustainable investment, but also reducing non-sustainable investment. In recent years, sustainable finance has grown significantly, but has not reached the required scale. In September 2021, this year, a few months back, the G20 Sustainable Finance Work Group, which is chaired jointly by the USA and China, they have prepared a multi-year roadmap for scaling up sustainable finance. So the relevant question, therefore, is where do individual countries currently stand within this roadmap? and what do the countries plan to do in the near term and medium term. And I would like the panelists to shed some light on this from their own country perspectives. Now, let me focus on three areas that I would like to pick up from this multi-year agenda. One is, if I can quote Mr. Ravi Menon, who is the Managing Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, in a recent speech, he emphasized that to make green finance work effectively, we need to solve the three Ds: data, definition, and disclosure. Now, when we are talking of green finance, the question might arise, why do we make definition an issue? Now, taxonomies are not the same across jurisdictions, but taxonomies across countries and markets have to be compatible. Otherwise, cross-border green finance flows will be severely constrained. Also, an effective taxonomy should include activities which are already green, as well as incorporate activities that are transition and enabling activities. Mobilizing finance to transitional activities is very important, as this will move the needle on climate action, especially in countries where many sectors are still emission intensive. A second important issue is the supporting role that central banks and financial regulators must play in mainstreaming green finance. To ensure that climate change risks do not threaten financial stability, the regulatory and supervisory framework has to integrate these risks into the lending strategies and risk management system of banks. Now, the green financing policy instruments that are relevant in this context can be grouped into four different policy areas: macroprudential policy, microprudential policy, market-making policy, for example, developing green bond guidelines, and credit allocation policy. Now, there are two agencies that could play a very important role in this regard. One is the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system, the NGFS, that was established in December 2017 and has grown dramatically in membership since then. The NGFS has developed a broad set of analyses and practical tools to share knowledge and best practices in the field of microprudential supervision. As for macroprudential tool, the Basel Accord would seem to be the most powerful and relevant. However, the capital and liquidity requirements under Basel III Accord do not necessarily require banks to evaluate the impacts of climate risks on their balance sheets. Basel standards do not differentiate green loans from other corporate loans in terms of risk weighting. So, an important question which can be raised here is, should regulators allow a lowering of capital and liquidity requirements to benefit environmentally sustainable economic activities? That said, the supervisory review under Pillar 2 and market discipline under Pillar 3 of the Basel Accord offers some ways in which this accord can improve the banking sector's management of systemic environmental risks. The third critical issue, obviously, is mobilization of finance. Now, Mr. Mahajan will have a lot to say coming from the private sector initiative, but I would like to highlight one very important consideration here, and this is the role of stepping up international climate finance and transfers from developed to developing countries. The financial commitment from developed to developing countries has fallen short of the goal so far and has to be stepped up, and the grant element has to be increased. In this context, a relevant consideration is the use of available firepower of the pool of unutilized SDRs. Now, as we all know, the IMF has proposed to establish a new resilience and sustainability trust to support climate action in low-income and vulnerable middle-income countries. But beyond this, in my opinion, SDRs could be potentially channeled through multilateral development banks. A second issue is, how can private finance be mobilized and can leverage on official finance? Now, public and private investors can join forces through blended finance to address project risks. Right, so what is the scope for this? Governments and multilateral development banks can help de-risk sustainability projects by taking on first loss equity and providing guarantees. And I'm sure Mr. Mahajan will have more to say on this, and Sadani as well. Now, the third element in all this is, of course, that if you have green projects and you want to attract finance, you need to have an understanding of the portfolio. So here one has to improve the impact analysis and implement a consistent set of global standards for disclosure and reporting on sustainability metrics. A challenge here is, well, you can get finance, but how can financing be provided to marginally bankable but worthy green projects? Here for example, in India, the SME segment in the renewable energy market is starved of finance. So should central banks make funding available to banks on generous terms in order to promote lending to environmentally sustainable economic activities? Would this undermine credibility of the overall monetary policy should central banks act in this manner? Well, these are the thoughts which come to my mind. So I would look forward to the participants in the panel to shed light on these issues and other key aspects of green finance. So Danny, I now turn to you for your keynote address.
Thank you very much indeed, Energy. And in your introduction, you have highlighted some of the most important issues, and I hope I'll be able to shed light on some of those, and especially the points about mobilizing private sector finance for a clean investment during my remarks. But before I do, I wanted to express my gratitude for the opportunity to take part in this event, and particularly to give my thanks to the RIS. I recall very warmly the close cooperation that we had in the lead up to the 2018 AIB annual meeting in Mumbai, and the active role that RIS played in that, and particularly Dr. Satin Chaturvedi. So it's a great honor to be able to re-engage and take part in this Brics economic conclave, which provides an opportunity to engage with policymakers, experts, and partners on this climate topic, which is the most urgent. Before I get into that, let me say a word about AIIB. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a relatively new, multilateral development bank. We were established after the initial proposal from the Chinese president. The AIB started work in January 2016 with 57 founding members. All 5 of the Brics members were founding signatories of the AIB. Today, AIB has 104 members around the world, AAA credit rating, noted for the high standards of governance and the high standards we apply to our projects, and really an established member of the family of multilateral development banks. And you were right in your introduction to highlight the importance of MDBs in this green space. As for AIB, we last year approved our first corporate strategy, focusing on what we call infrastructure for tomorrow. In other words, thinking about how we can finance in our members, and especially low and middle income countries in Asia, infrastructure that helps to meet the needs in the next few decades, and especially green infrastructure, technology-enabled infrastructure, connectivity, and private capital mobilization. So very much in keeping with the themes of this conclave, both yesterday and today. And we're equipped with a range of instruments to finance projects, both sovereign projects and non-sovereign. We can also finance projects outside Asia, particularly where they're focused on reducing carbon emissions or on connectivity. China is our largest shareholder. We're headquartered in Beijing. We have a modest but growing portfolio in China. India is the largest borrower from AIB. Nearly 25% of our portfolio is in India. It's also the second largest shareholder. We have a big program of clean energy investment in India. I've just returned from the COP26 meetings in Glasgow. In fact, I'm speaking to you from the quarantine hotel in Shanghai, where I'm on my way after 21 days back to Beijing. I heard Prime Minister Modi's speech, which was, I think, one of the most impressive speeches at the event, setting out India's further commitments. Among the BRICS countries, also Russia is the third largest member of AIB. We have a growing portfolio there. And actually, Russia will also host the 2022 annual meeting of the bank next October. So I hope very much that many of you will be able to join us there. Brazil completed ratification of AIB in November last year, and we're already working on our first investment projects in Brazil. South Africa was one of the founding participants, has not yet completed its domestic ratification of the AIB Charter, has to do so by the deadline, which is the end of next year, and we're working closely with them to ensure that that happens. Today's topic is critically important, as green finance is the key to increase the level of financial flows to sustainable development priorities, and promoting also in the short term a green recovery of the world economy after the pandemic. As you implied in your introduction, Professor Banerjee, perhaps in a decade or two we will no longer talk about green finance because all finance will have to be green. But in this period we have to really scale up towards that objective. And in that context we see that both green finance and ESG, environmental social governance, investments are blossoming around the world. Globally, the green bond market increased from $40 billion in 2015 to $280 billion in 2020, and is expected to grow by 55% annually. And from 2005 to 2020, global ESG investment has increased 4.5-fold and continues to grow by more than 20% annually. By deploying green finance to facilitate a sustainable recovery, we could avoid having substantial rises in CO2 emissions post-pandemic, as we saw sadly after the global financial crisis in 2008. And coming back from Glasgow, green finance, and particularly private sector finance, was a major part of the agenda. Finance ministers attended on the Finance Day, and all the leaders also focused on this, and it's a major focus of the Glasgow Climate Pact that was agreed there. And I think that Professor Banerjee, you highlighted an important issue, which is so far the failure of developed countries to live up to their obligations to meet the $100 billion commitment for financial flows to the developing world. Clearly, that's being pushed forward as a result of Glasgow, and it's critical that those obligations are met, because we've also seen at COP26 very substantial new commitments by AIB members, especially here in Asia. All of the Brics countries are committed to net zero. Commitments to net zero by 2050, 2060, or 2070 are huge changes in development strategy. And expanding renewable energy is a key part of that, all of which requires very substantial finance. And Nick Stern, Lord Stern, who I know is well known in India, and also as one of the leading figures in thinking through the climate change issues, talks about green finance and green development as needing to be the development story of the 21st century. In other words, that green development is not decoupled from the rightful development needs of developing countries, but is coupled with it, so that through green investment, we also support development and increasing living standards and increasing growth. And the last thing to say, I think, as a core message from COP26 is that really this decade, the 2020s, is the critical decade to make this shift, because it's the emissions reductions that we make, or indeed fail to make, in this decade, which will determine whether or not we can still be on a path to limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is the target of the Paris Agreement. Already we've seen temperatures rise by 1.1 degrees, and that in itself is already having terribly damaging effects around the world. Just last week in our board meeting, we were discussing in AIB a loan in China to support climate adaptation. For AIB, we want to work with our members to support the shift towards green finance and towards sustainable development pathways. We were created just after the Paris Agreement. Only a few weeks later, AIB started work. and being a green institution has been one of our core values since the inception. We've announced that we will align all of our operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement by July the 1st, 2023. That means that in addition to climate finance, every project, even if it has no direct relationship to climate, will have to be proven to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, or we can no longer deliver finance. And I think that Paris alignment is something that could be developed across other financial sectors. In terms of the overall goals, I mentioned the corporate strategy and the 4 thematic priorities. We've set an ambitious agenda to scale up our own climate finance, to have at least 50% of AIB's financing being climate finance by 2025. And that should mean that by the end of the decade, we contribute at least $50 billion for climate projects around Asia. And of course, it's important to say that, and again, I think this is something that should apply more broadly and beyond the MDBs, and where the MDBs can show some leadership, is that environmental and social sustainability should be mainstreamed throughout all operations, through all investments. AIB's environmental and social framework, which we apply to every project, means that all of our support to our clients will achieve environmentally and socially sustainable development outcomes in line with high international standards and in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think this is one of the services that MDBs can provide also to the private sector, is assurance of high standards and high quality projects. One of the major challenges to scale up green finance is also to scale up the volume of high quality projects that can then be attractive to invest in. I also want to highlight in this context another issue that was central to the agenda in Glasgow at COP26, which is the link between climate and conserving and protecting biodiversity. This has not been perhaps so much of the agenda and the discussion in recent years, but needs to be much more so, not least because nature-based solutions to many of the infrastructure challenges we face can present both cost-effective and environmentally sensitive ways of achieving at least some of the goals, and especially in relation to mitigation and adaptation. Nature-based solutions can help enormously. At the same time, we need to make sure that that we play a key role in adhering to green norms and practices in emerging markets, including in the Brics countries. Through financial innovation and partnership, we want to help build a green finance ecosystem to de-risk and cut down cost by demonstration and by co-financing. To date, our investments in Brics countries have covered 39 projects amounting to $9.5 billion US. But within some of that, we've also sought to innovate, to help to support the development of Asian capital markets to be more attractive to international investors and to be more climate focused. For example, and I should say that there is a way to go in Asian capital markets to develop green finance and green instruments to the extent that they have developed in, for example, Europe or North America. So under our Asia Climate Bond portfolio, we've developed a climate change investment framework in partnership with Amundi and the Climate Bond Initiative to set a clear definition and approach for Paris alignment in the capital markets. And the idea of this is to allow investors to identify and engage with companies who are issuing bonds to better align their financings with the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement on mitigation, adaptation, and shifting financial flows. The distinction here is that we don't look at the proceeds of the bond, we look at the issuer as a whole. Sometimes there are accusations of greenwashing when a company that has a number of perhaps environmental...
In 2008. And I was reminded of Financial Times, the trade editor. I'm forgetting the name. If somebody could remind me of the name. He published a long article putting the entire blame on India. And surprise, surprise, when Trump started riding roughshod over the Brits and he put sanctions against the Brits, very sheepishly, 2 years ago, he came out and he published another article saying that actually the fiasco of 2008 was not on account of India, it was on account of the US. It took him all this while, from 2008 to 2018 or 19 to come clean on this aspect. So we all know how this blame game is played, and I think it was the orchestra was just building up the crescendo to come to a crescendo to find some scapegoats and to threaten countries that if you do this, this is what the world press will say about you. Now we are rid of this. I am very glad that the ministerial has been postponed, and now it gives us an opportunity to question, to have thorough discussions, and to get into the technical aspects of each of these papers, whether it is fisheries subsidies. They have been, and I'm really, sick and tired of this same ploy being used by the developed countries, that it is for a great philanthropic idea, sustainable stocks. Yes, but have you really addressed sustainability through this text? No, you haven't. You haven't done it because for the high seas, there is no control on subsidies. That is where India's proposal has to be seen in perspective, that for 25 years, please don't allow capacity building and subsidization for the fishing fleets. Now, this is the kind of questioning which has to take place. The chair can't supplant his or her wisdom on the group and then try to put it before the ministers for a decision, and neither can the DG do it. And if the DG has been trying to do that, then I think she needs to be reminded that the WTO has always been and continues to be a member-driven process. It is not a DG-driven process. It is not a process driven by a few interested proponents, however powerful they may be. And that is how it is going to remain. So this gives us a very good opportunity to question each and every paper that was going to be presented by the DG to the ministers, starting with fisheries subsidies, then this WTO reforms paper of the EU. The third one is on agriculture. The agriculture paper, I think, is a mess. And agriculture, we have negotiated so hard for so long, and most of the issues had been resolved. Till, of course, President Obama came to power, and the US ambassador said that the whole text which was produced in December 2008 was in square brackets. But you can't, brush it under the carpet, the entire work that has gone on, and suddenly come up and say that all subsidies, whether developing countries are giving them or developed countries are giving them, trade distorting support and production distorting support, everything should be cut by half by 2030. People who have gained an advantage by dirty tariffication, by concealing their actual subsidies, and the US and the EU are prime examples of that. There may be others as well. This is well documented. And then you say that we will do nothing, and then the developing countries will bear the brunt of cutting their subsidies, so-called subsidies. And the intention, the invisible hand is going towards the throat of the developing countries, whether it is in the form of the development box, Article 6.2 of the Agreement on Agriculture, which was thoroughly negotiated hard and obtained by the developing countries, because for most of them, there is no amber box, because they were not rich enough to afford an amber box.
Other partners to support all of AIB's members towards a green recovery and to taking the steps necessary to keep carbon emissions under control, to keep global temperature rises down, and to do so in a way that supports the economic development that developing countries in Asia need. I would like to express my gratitude once again to the organizers of this conclave and look forward to listening and to learning from others and to a fruitful discussion in the rest of this panel. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Sir Danny, for this very informative address and for elaborating for us the growing role which the AIB is playing in the region. And the very important takeaway that I get in terms of the role model that it can be is the AIB financing for all projects will be aligned with the Paris Agreement by 2023. I think that's a very, very important goal to, if you fulfill, and it's something, a challenge that other MDBs and other asset holders can look at and take it as an example. So I now will turn to our three distinguished panelists. I call upon Professor Carlos Eduardo Frickman-Young. We are running a little bit late, so can I please ask you to restrict your presentation to no more than 6 minutes? I'm sorry for this, but Professor Young.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It is always a big pleasure to have a Brics event. It is not something new for all of you. Brazil, my country, is currently in a process of growing isolation from the rest of the world. We are becoming like the bad example in many issues, and it is very important to discuss joint solutions. Brazil has been an important break for the concept of Brics, and it's very important to keep this idea alive and having events like that where we can share our thoughts. Professor Banerjee said in his opening remarks the importance of the 3Ds, and I'll talk a little bit about definition. What is sustainable or green finance? It is the finance for the green economy. What is a green economy? It's an economic model of development where the dynamics of investment, the dynamics of income and employment generation is motivated by the transition towards sustainable development goals. That's a very simple, it's not academical, but very practical way to think about sustainable finance. It's the finance that will operate in this transition towards a sustainable world, would be not only low carbon, but also biodiversity concerned, socially equal, and that we're going to improve life standards, not for the current, but also for future generations. But it's very important to understand that this transition towards green economy, it will not happen voluntarily or spontaneously. It has to be led by public policies. And this is the first challenge that we have to face. It requires political will from the authorities, in this case, monetary and financial authorities towards this transition. And unfortunately, in my country, we are still facing an old-fashioned debate that in most of the world has already been dismissed. But in my country, unfortunately, is a kind of day-by-day situation that there remains a view that this transition towards sustainability is against the economy. And because of that, predatory, gray activities, just to say something in opposition to green or sustainable activities, remain leading the process. So my first point is that we cannot have green finance or sustainable finance if there's no if there's not a bigger, a broader perspective of transition towards sustainability, and this requires public policy. What is, in general terms, the internalization of externalities in the financial world, which is the main issue, how we can get this transition. And I think this, in practical terms, is something that's being tried, and we still do not have something, a simple solution. Actually, we won't have one solution. We're going to have plenty of solutions of that. In the previous talk, certainly Alexandra has already addressed some of the problems, including issues such as greenwashing and problems like that. We definitely need better disclosure on this transition, in this movement. In this requires certainly an active role of authorities. So my point is that this green economy is made by private institutions, but it requires a move from the public policy perspective that requires enforcement. And if it does not happen, if this concern with the enforcement of the transition to sustainability do not happen within the authority, in our discussion here, the financial sector, both financial markets from the private perspective and the policy authorities, this transition will remain a kind of greenwashing. That's the problem my country is facing now. Risk is an important point. This is a very important reason why private investors should be aware of this. In a transition in 2030, 2040, the world will be different from today. So they have to be concerned on this long term, but also they should think that thinking in long term usually provides better revenues than thinking in short term. And thinking in the long term means think sustainably, and something that is also an important transition on that. And we are still facing with the problems, old problems, such as subsidized credits to predatory activities. I will raise a very important issue, which is deforestation. Most of deforestation remains financed by private or public institutions with subsidized credits. Direct subsidized from wrong fiscal policies, but indirect subsidies from nature, because the issue of internalizing externalities has not been addressed in the financial control sheets from the private institutions. They should include in their evaluation of projects the externalities. This is something that can be done. It is difficult, but it requires some pressure, which I believe is growing on. But the international financial community can improve a lot. In this sense, all these international institutions can help a lot. Something that is very interesting is how the IMF nowadays is getting sustainability as a headline for its activities. Another point that I would like to raise is that subnational governments in federative countries are very important. And most of the financial policies are addressed towards national governments. And if there is a situation where the national government thinks in a way and subnational governments think in another way, it's not only the example of current Brazil. We can think about the previous US administration under President Trump, while the federal government was going backwards to the old-fashioned model of predatory economy. There are many state governments moving towards sustainability, including creating their own credit market, carbon credit market. So we should think about how to create policies that could involve more subnational governments. Of course, they do not issue money. They don't have the role. They are not monetary authorities, but they are fiscal authorities, and they have a crucial role in projects. So I think that we should have better involvement of the subnational governments in the finance discussion, not only the national and the private sector as usual. And I know that my time is short. I would like to talk a bit on infrastructure, as already mentioned by Sardani. In COP26, I could not be there physically, but I made a presentation with a congressman in Brazil, Deputy Alessandro Molon. We are working in large-scale program. We call it Green New Deal Brazil. It's built on 30 actions that could make a difference. I will not get into details on these 30 actions. It moves from both rural to urban issues. But one specific point that I'd like to talk to you. In our model, we think that with 100 US billions per year, 10 years time, we can make this transition towards what we think it's closer to the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. And we estimated that most of this funding can come domestically from income generation through tax generation and income multiplier effects of this investment. We can also go into this very much detail, but one specific point, most of these investments privately are feasible, are profitable, but they require a big push. Just give one very simple example, electrification of urban buses. What we need is just the initial capital and the interest of the political will of that. So there are many opportunities on that, also including the biodiversity. There is an initiative by UNDP, which is BioFin, financing biodiversity. There are many possibilities of that, but we require a push from both the private sector, but also the public sector. And we need to get this thing solved jointly. Otherwise, we will remain keeping, lagging compared to the rest of the world. I'm going to keep the rest of my comments for the second round.
Thank you, Professor Young. So much to talk about and so little time, so we need to move on. And I think one very important takeaway from your presentation, which is at least new to me, is the important role that subnational governance can play in especially the larger countries, which are huge. So it's not just looking at the national level, but the subnational level of governance is very, very important. Thank you very much for that point. Dr. Ghosh from the Reserve Bank of India. This is a very timely intervention on your part. The Reserve Bank of India recently issued a notification that there is a role for central banks and regulators to play in mainstreaming green finance. And yet in India, it seems that the risks of climate change risks and investment and the risks associated with non-sustainable projects is not integrated into the business models of the banks.
Sir, I have a request.
Yes.
Mr. Rajiv Mahajan has to leave for another meeting, so if you could.
Okay, so we can come back to the Mr. Ghosh, if you will please allow Mr. Mahajan to come in. Mr. Mahajan, my apologies. We look forward to your perspective on this very interesting topic.
Thank you, Professor Vishwajit and Professor Saurabh. My deepest apologies. It was indeed very enlightening to hear the previous speakers speak about their perspectives. From my vantage point at the Green Climate Fund, we inherently see a paradox. On one hand, you have trillions of dollars earning negative interest rates in many OECD markets. On the other hand, you have a huge climate, low carbon investment opportunity in developing countries running to the tune of nearly $30 billion running through till 2030. And that financing is not being realized. Now, this financing is particularly being constrained by a number of barriers as we see them today. And these include policy, market, and capacity barriers that do not incentivize low carbon, climate resilient investments on a sustained basis. There are innovation, technology, technical barriers that limit the number of climate technology incubators and accelerators, particularly in developing countries. There are financing barriers that exist because of the perceived risks, high cost of capital, and high return expectations, which may or may not be actually true. The barriers that exist due to domestic financial systems and also because domestic financial systems misprice risks. And in our work with the private sector across the world, we aim to address these barriers convincingly. We feel that for climate finance to actually flow to critical markets, including the LDCs and the small island developing states, these barriers have to be consistently and systematically addressed. To that end, at the GCF, we adopted an updated strategic plan in 2020, which aims to address a few strategic priority areas, which include the strengthening of programming within countries that not only aim to develop a pipeline of climate projects, but also aim to address some of these barriers systematically. We also aim to foster a paradigm shifting portfolio of climate projects, and then aim to catalyze private sector financing at scale. And also internally aim to improve on our processes to aim to improve access to the funds resources. We are also in the process of developing a new private sector strategy, which should be unveiled over the next couple of months, which essentially is based on 4 pillars. The first one is promoting a conducive investment environment and strengthening capacity within countries to take on new and innovative climate projects. The second pillar being accelerating innovation for climate technologies, financing instruments, and business models. The third pillar being de-risking market creating projects to establish a commercial track record so that commercial banks and financial institutions, pension funds can come in and invest into climate as a new asset class. The fourth pillar would be strengthening domestic financial institutions to scale up private sector climate investments. And the GCF being the institution as being the key institution of the Paris Agreement, we are capital agnostic and we have a high risk tolerance. We can provide patient capital for transformative climate impact. This makes us a partner of choice for catalytic projects by assuming early stage risk, and we would like to enable a higher mobilization from the private sector by developing structures which facilitate investment. And we were very happy to hear during the beginning of this meeting, where Sir Danny actually mentioned that they have taken up the accreditation process with the GCF. And with that, I hand over back to you, Professor Vishwadip.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahajan, for identifying the new private sector strategy that your agency is developing, and for especially highlighting that the domestic financial system is mispricing risk, which is a very important barrier to financing green investment. So now let's move on to Dr. Saurabh Ghosh of the Reserve Bank of India. If you could please in particular share where India faces the biggest problems. We have heard Sir Danny mention that India is the largest borrower from the AIIB, but yet India has a very intensive, energy intensive sector in the form of coal. Investment in coal has been privatized, which means they will need financing from banks and others, and yet it is supposed to be an unsustainable activity. So where do you see the challenges as to how India can move forward?
Okay, thank you indeed for this opportunity, and it's a pleasure speaking to this forum. Now let me start discussing from the first 2 Ds, the data and disclosure. So I think the first step in this entire process is having a better quality of data and dissemination of policy information. In that vein, we are trying to include sustainable finance and green finance in all our official, statutory, and research publications to the best possible way. And we also monitor that what kind of information or what kind of penetration it's doing in the entire marketplace. So in the bulletin article recently, if you see, we have been analyzing the Google Trend data to see that how far the new terminologies, the terminologies like say ESG or say climate bond, green change has been picked up in India, and Indian green bond is doing. We are also trying to do a lot of analysis on the basis of big data to shed light on how much the information penetration or the awareness penetration is taking place in a country, in a vast country like India, which is kind of very heterogeneous in terms of its scope and challenges. Now, moving over to challenges, the first step is to analyze the challenges with appropriate research. And we know that that climate, this green finance and climate change thing can have two kind of implications. One is physical risk and another is transitional risk. Now, in the physical response, we tried to see that how our macro stability is getting impacted with the changing global features and global dimension. In that aspect, we try to do a kind of naturally controlled experiment. Unfortunately or fortunately, from a statistician's point of view, we have a lot of coastal states which are very badly affected by natural calamities almost every year. We take the coastal state data and compare with non-coastal state to see what kind of financial stability issues that this increased flood or drought may have on a country like India. And we find that the state GDP is getting impacted disproportionately in the coastal state when it is impacted by flood. One of the major concern may be the inflation thing, that inflation is adversely being affected. Inflation is going up, and it is especially so for food and vegetable inflation. When a coastal state gets impacted by a natural calamity, and it's happening again and again. Eastern coast was the most prone to this vulnerabilities before, but coming to the recent data, Western coast is also getting impacted, like say Gujarat coast and coastal provinces of Kerala is no exception today. And we find the same kind of physical risk to this coast. Turning over to the financial stability now. What is happening in terms of financial stability? As Professor Banerjee has already indicated that there was a press release recently after or during the Glasgow summit, which said we are closely following the developments in NGFS. India has become a member of NGFS since April this year. And we are contributing in all the work stream of NGFS through research and through all other developments. In our financial stability report, we are again and again covering more of what kind of transitional risk that the country might go through if the climate and the green finance things are taken. If you see the last financial stability report of July this year, you will find that a detailed analysis of steel industry, how steel industry can get impacted through this kind of changes in financial pattern that has been covered. If we go more into detail in one of the bulletin articles, it has been flagged that what is our collection from the green bond issuance all over the world. There is a table and there is a narrative there which shows that, of course, we are not in the toppers of the class, perhaps, but at the same time, we are not at the backbenchers. Our green finance have been progressing and gradually progressing well. Now, Professor Banerjee also pointed out about the renewable resources, especially small sector in renewable resources. If I may say that this renewable resources, small scale industries have been included in priority sector lending by Reserve Bank of India. And there have been several other policies which are kind of being considered or being actively researched within Reserve Bank of India. So yeah, I know that there are a lot to be done, and we have embarked into the path, especially during the post-COVID recovery period. I hope that more of this data dissemination, research, and appropriate policy, public policy in this domain will help in getting us to the right path in the sustainable growth recovery path. I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. We have finished at the right time. We have 2 more minutes. I don't see any questions from the floor, and we really do not have much time. So I'll just highlight a few of the points being made. But before that, I would like to express my thanks to Sadani, to Professor Young, to Mr. Mahajan, and to Dr. Ghosh for touching on all the issues that I had mentioned in my briefing remarks, plus more. And I think a few critical things which are very important. Apart from the fact, Sadani, Lord Nicholas Stern was my supervisor at the MPhil and DPhil level at Oxford. There's a link there, but you have highlighted that while we are talking of climate change, we also should not forget natural resource management and biodiversity. This is a new aspect of the expansion of the term sustainability and sustainable investment. Professor Young, you have highlighted the importance of externalities and public need for public policies, and that enforcement of transition is extremely important, and to assess the risks, assessment of the risks proper analysis is very important, as highlighted by Dr. Ghosh, and the impact of coastal areas is being felt all across the country in the form of higher food prices. So the macroeconomic impact is being visible, even if people think about climate change. We are not discussing in a vacuum. The changes are there for very much to see. And thank you for drawing attention to the financial stability report of the Reserve Bank of India. I'm sure the participants who would like to know more will be able to go and touch upon and read this document. So thank you all very much. I think we have learned a lot from this, and hopefully I see Dr. Chaturvedi over there. His agenda on green finance, he will take it forward in the coming days, because the next year is India's presidency of the G20. G20 already has climate finance on its radar. It's not going to go away. The multi-year agenda, which has been set forward by the working group, will continue. And I'm sure that under RIS's initiative, there will be more substantive thoughts being given into this. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Biswas Banerjee, for leading us through. It was excellent discussion today we had, and I'm sure with Brics presidency coming in, and of course now with the G20, India would be providing support and facilitate greater discussion with the New Development Bank. And I'm so glad that Sir Danny Alexander could join us and provide inputs. I think we had excellent discussion today. Thanks a lot. And I wanted to basically thank my own colleague, Biswajit Banerjee, for steering us through. So thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. So we would now switch over to the next session. Dash, you can guide us.
Thank you, sir. Now we move to a very important technical session, that is a digital economy. As you know, we are witnessing a very significant pace of digitalization across economies and across sectors. So the discussion would be incomplete if we do not cover those areas in the Brics Economic Cooperation. So we have 3 panelists, and the session would be chaired by Professor Thankam Arun. I just introduced the chair and hand over to him. So Professor Arun is Director, Center for Accountability and Global Development at University of Essex, UK. He also teaches at other business schools like Stellenbosch Business School, South Africa. He's also research fellow of IZA Bonn, and he also chairs academic steering group on financial inclusion in the International Cooperative and Mutual Insurance Federation, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and Royal Society of Arts, Manufacture and Commerce, and several other projects he's part of. So Professor Arun, may I request you to take over the proceedings of the rest of the sessions?
Thank you, Dr. Das. I think thank you RIS for organizing such a very illuminating session on reshaping global economic cooperation and the role of BRICS in it. And we have this session on digital economy now. We know that this is part and parcel of any modern economy these days. And we have, before introducing the eminent panel to you all, let me give some opening remarks on digital economy. And we agree that rapid digitalization that is affecting all aspects of our life in a way we interact, work, and do the shop and receive services, everything, the digital economy is playing a very important role. In many ways, that is creating a new reality for governments, enterprises, organizations, global markets, and also new ideas of economic growth in the coming days. And particularly during the COVID pandemic period, that has accelerated the digitalization. And some of you may know Prime Minister's PMJDY, Janathan Yojana in India, that has actually enhanced the number of participants during the COVID period. And the same thing happened all over the world. If you look into Africa or Latin America, you can see that kind of phenomenal expansion in terms of the use of digital services there. And a key challenge nowadays is how to govern and harness the surge of digitalization more positively. We know that the industrialization, the industrial revolution, which we experienced in the last century, and that has transformed the way in which we work towards many issues. And the same thing is happening in the case of digitalization as well. I remember a quote from famous economist Solow in 1987, who claimed that you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And that sort of a productivity puzzle actually conquered us for many years. And when we discuss about the growth accounting literature, the digital economies have a very important role in it. And interestingly, if you look into the impact of digitalization in the financial sector, there are many studies which clearly shows that in a post-1995 period, there was a productivity surge mainly due to digital investment and usage. So we live, if somebody asked me whether are you in the early stages of digitalization or the middle stages of digitalization or the final stages of digitalization, we don't have an answer, because it can happen either way, it can interpret in that way. But one thing is clear, we are using more and more machines and techniques to analyze the data around us. So that is going to have very long-standing transformative impact on the way which we treat economic growth in the coming years. And no doubt the BRICS countries have a very important role in this one. And we know that many of these, I think all of the BRIC countries have invested quite heavily on digitalization, and digital transformation is quite high in these economies. As some of you may remember, some of the statistics says that even 1% of digital investment in BRIC countries, that can lead to the multiple effect in terms of economic growth and their contribution to the global economy. So in that way, the agenda of digital economy is very crucial in the case of BRICS economies. And that's what we are going to discuss today. And we have, as I said earlier, we have a very eminent list of panelists. The first member, Dr. Alexandra Moroskida, and she is head of Structural Reforms Division at the Economic Expert Group and also a senior fellow at the Financial Research Institute of Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation. And last year, she was a member of the Brics Expert Council to look under the chairmanship of Russian Federation in the Brics for the second time. So no doubt, she is a very competent person to talk about, what is happening in BRIC and what we can know about the BRICS experience and what are the challenges within the BRICS ambit we need to address. Our second speaker is Mr. Arvind Gupta. Arvind Gupta is a head and co-founder of Digital India Foundation, a policy think tank working in areas of digital inclusion, smart cities, internet governance. So no doubt, all the key issues in the modern world. And Mr. Arvind actually touched upon his vast 27 years of experience, worked in diverse sectors of leadership, policy, and entrepreneurial profiles in India and Silicon Valley in USA. And our third speaker for today is Ms. Kiesom Nodap Masalli, and she is a senior advisor, Chief Digital Office, United Nations Development Program in New York. And she is currently on secondment to this one. She is on a sabbatical as well as the head of the Asia Pacific region for the UN Better Than Cash Alliance. And she co-led the UN Principles for Responsible Digital Payments and convenes high-level country and regional dialogues on the next billion users. So in a way, we are so lucky to have three different speakers, three distinct areas of expertise on digital economy, and we would like to hear from them. Considering the time, I would suggest to restrict the first set of interventions, 10 minutes each, and then we will go for question and answer sessions. So let me invite Dr. Alexandra Moroskida for the first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Aaron, and good day, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you hear me well. It's the first question that everyone asks nowadays. And first, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for the opportunity to speak at such a distinguished conference. Today, we discuss the opportunities of the digital economy and the ways to boost it. And let me share my PowerPoint presentation with you. I hope that you see it now. As Professor Aaron already mentioned, we all believe that there will be some digital dividends and so-called profits of the digital economy that all of the people around the world and in our nations can share, and which can empower people. But let's look at the latest UN report on the digital economy. And we can see that most of the digital technologies are used by internet users to access the social networks and buying something on internet or music, video games, and such entertainments. Not for the better use of public services or other essential services, which account for, in some cases, less than 10% of all the internet usage cases. And this is an illustration to the fact that as digital infrastructure develops and reaches the most remote areas, as we move toward the next levels of digitalization, the policy measures in the first place must be focused on creation of the useful digital content, and including the e-government services, education, healthcare, etc., and increase the capabilities of the people to use these digital technologies more effectively. This is a kind of a digital literacy issue. It is a widely accepted opinion that the fourth industrial revolution will likely lead to more inequality given different access opportunities and capabilities of people and countries to use the new technologies. And this is one of the most urgent issues. Studies indicate the rigidity of the social inequality and the share of the wealthiest 10% of population. This graph on the slide shows the data on the share of the 10th wealthiest people and the second quintile. For the 91 countries for which the data are available, and we can see clearly that the gap between these two groups of incomes, which are kind of rich people and middle income people, widens. And given the role of the growing role of the digital skills and the issue of ensuring broader access to digital technology and especially to essential services by these digital technologies such as healthcare and education becomes a particularly important tool in reduction of this inequality, or at least preventing of its increase. At the same time, we must know that the BRICS countries are doing rather good at national level, and there are extensive data on the digitalization in BRICS on the national level. But what is important is that we have to ensure that there are no lagging behind of the least developed regions. And as we can see on this slide, there is a huge regional differences in BRICS countries by the level of digitalization. This level varies by the countries of the group, and Russia and Brazil are doing better than other BRICS countries. But still, it is important for all of the 5 countries to ensure the equality of digitalization by regions and by the social groups of people. And given the active building of digital infrastructure and embodying it in all of these national strategies and in the strategy for BRICS economic development that was adopted last year during the Russian presidency. The second level digital divide comes to the fore, the so-called digital literacy divide, which can be defined as the harnessing the capabilities for harnessing digital data and frontier technologies. In particular, lack of the computer knowledge or some technical knowledge is a key obstacle to internet usage in China, and among the 3 main obstacles to internet usage in India and Brazil. We, with my colleagues, found the evidence of digital literacy assessments only in Russia and India. However, in other 3 countries, authorities conduct sample surveys which contain the question on the why people do not use the internet, and one of the key answers is that the people do not have the relevant knowledge of the technology. This can serve as an indicator of the scope of the second level digital divide. Although by no means these data are comparable or comprehensive, but it shows the scope of this second level digital divide issue in some of the BRICS countries. And this becomes a priority when talking about the development of digital economy. We cannot foster it without ensuring that all of the population have the capabilities to benefit from it. Assessment of the current state of the digital literacy and identification of key challenges and monitoring of the dynamics is especially important in terms of the development of the new agenda and policy measures. 2 BRICS countries, India and Russia, regularly assess digital literacy, as I've already stated. Russia uses the European methodology, so-called Digital Competencies 2.0, DCOMP, and India has developed its own program. UNESCO and G20 base its works on digital literacy. UNESCO is developing a digital literacy global framework, and it is based on the European methodology which Russia uses. But and this is kind of a comprehensive view from the advanced economies, but it's too broad, and there are too many indicators for usage in the developing countries. Indian program assesses only the learning outcomes of its beneficiaries as per indicators which are shown on the slide. And most of the developing countries have more basic applied problems in terms of digital literacy than the DCOMP, the European methodology, addresses. First, the large share of population in developing countries live in rural areas, and therefore, their main concern is using digital technologies in the remote areas, for example, the e-government, and opportunities to get different services remotely. This theme is also important in Russia, where the digital public services are gaining momentum with more than 130 million users are registered on the Russian Gosuslugi portal, the Russian government services. And more than 200 million services were provided during the last year. And access to e-government is well reflected in the Indian program, but has no highlights in the European methodology. In it, it lies within browsing, searching, and filtering data, information, and digital content competency, which is extremely broad and doesn't reflect the specifics of the e-government services, and actually can be attributed to any search in the internet. And second, the large role in the developing countries and Brics in particular is played by agriculture. And for example, in China, the share of internet agricultural products retail sale is expected to reach 15% by 2025. And Brazil actively promotes agriculture. We all know about digital agriculture in Brazil. It's an example for all other Brics countries. India has numerous government programs aimed at the digitalization of infrastructure. In Russia, the agricultural digital program is developed, and so on. So the second important field of application of digital literacy competencies in developing countries is agriculture-related digital services, which is not reflected at all in the existing digital literacy assessment services, assessment models. It can be a part of the broader in the broader extent of the use of information toward professional goals, which is regarded by many researchers as an important aspect of the digital literacy. So I think that the main driver of digital economy and ensuring sharing that we can share, that all of us can share the digital dividends is education, which also includes digital literacy education. I know that Professor Arun is actively engaged in the research on financial literacy, if I'm correct. And so we can be here both advocates for education in the area of digitalization. So I do not say that there has to be a special course in every country and in every school on digital literacy, but in some areas it might be helpful. But it has to be embodied in the included in the education process. For example, it should be incorporated in the teaching through the guidance, for example, through the reliable sources of information for the pupils. And teaching, for example, to read the, I don't know, the original sources first rather than reposting. There is a famous joke in Russia that Vladimir Lenin once said that the main problem with the quotes in the internet is that you cannot rely on their authorship, and that people immediately believe them. And not everyone understands, especially in the young population, that it is a joke. They actually believe the quote. So it might be really helpful that that kind of the accent in the modern education. So thus BRICS countries, which often position themselves as the expert centers for other developing nations, could step in with a more active agenda in the digital literacy sphere, on the concept of digital literacy and on the definition of digital literacy and its assessment tools, which better reflect the developing country needs than the currently developed international concept. Thank you for your attention. Here
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Moroskina, for a very illuminating presentation about the challenges of first level and second level digital divide, and also touched upon the impact of digitalization on society. I'm so happy to hear about the impact of digitalization on agriculture, because that is a very backbone of most of the economies, most of the BRICS economies there. But it is interesting that the point on global income inequality and widening, it does not decrease, not widening, but it does not decrease during the period of digitalization. And that opens up more questions on how to develop more integrated national strategies and also to share the knowledge between BRICS countries in terms of developing curriculum, learning program, etc. And I think I mentioned this in a question in a related session on financial sector yesterday, because what is missing is the kind of learning space, the learning space for the countries to share their information. We have many platforms there, but to what extent these platforms are actually getting into the nitty-gritty of the minor things in terms of doing things. I think that's what we are missing. So thank you once again for your very powerful intervention. And our next panelist is Mr. Arvind Gupta. Gupta, please. We can see. Thank you.
Please unmute yourself.
Yeah.
There is a mute, unmute.
Got it. It's different on different software.
Yes,
so
yes.
just forget it out. Thank you, Professor Arun, for having me, and RIS for organizing this. Very briefly, I know we are limited on time, but Professor Alexandra just said on the second level inequalities. My presentation is going to be all about the first level, which is a national priority on building platforms. We mentioned about platforms exist in all forms. I'm going to pitch for platforms which are public in nature. So let me just start with an example. Like we have highways, which are public good infrastructure, and then highways we have cars, and cars are driven by people who are licensed to drive. Professor Alexandra made a comparison and potential area for cooperation that we should have more licensed drivers. You take it to the internet. You have the internet as really the super highway, but within those, what is an approach is to create more public infrastructure. And within this whole big super highway, can we create more digital public infrastructure which can be used by everybody? And of course, and on those, can we have more informed users, more literate users, and the cost of the car, which is in the case of the internet device, can we have a lower cost so that we have better access? Now, India's approach on this has been something that I think my next panelist, Ms. Kezum, will also talk about, is that we have India as a nation, and this is the area of cooperation, has taken a path of building public goods platforms, digital platforms as public goods. This is a very unique approach, which many other nations can learn from or imbibe, and we can learn from them. Is that, and I will explain it through examples, that most of the things that most of the developed economies or Eastern economies like China or Western economies like US have done is create platforms which are top down, I always call it. Means they solve the problems of the top tier, the middle tier, and then think about the bottom tier. India needed a new approach when we started embracing the fourth industrial revolution, and we actually took an approach which is a bottom-up approach, which is an approach which is a societal and developmental approach, and not an approach, as Professor Alexandra was also mentioning, where people are spending more time on games, but
millions this is worth. This is so cool. Have the Daytona, a couple Berlinetta boxers, have an Espada. This place is amazing. Wow, I mean, they have everything here. This is beautiful. Yeah, if you guys are ever in Singen, Germany, come to Auto Salon. I could stare at these cars for hours. I think we probably will. Check out that crazy intake. The Zonda Cinque. So this car was supposed to be the last iteration of the Zonda. There's only 5 of them in the world. This is the only orange one. 7.3 liter V12, 670 horsepower. This car is a road-going version of the Zonda R. So this car uses a special type of carbon fiber mixed with titanium, so it's carbo titanium, which increases the strength and rigidity. This thing is incredible. That roof scoop is mental. Check out this pretty cool little Lotus Esprit. We hardly ever see these things in North America. So we are at Autobau, which is a museum / collection. Apparently all the cars in this place are owned by the same person. We're an hour east of Zurich. So I have been told by Alex Penfold that right there is the only Saleen S7 in Europe. It's a Ford GT. You can see a Viper back there. America, bro. I have been incredibly spoiled on this trip. I mean, some of the places we have gone are incredible, and this place is right up there with every single one of them. We have the Ferrari Daytona, the 330 GTO. I don't even want to begin to guess how valuable that car is right there. We have the Dino right here. Check out this La Ferrari. How incredibly gorgeous is this? It's a solid color. It doesn't have the black roof. I've been wanting to see one like this for so long. It looks spectacular. We have the F40 back there, and of course the yellow TDF. What an impressive color for that car. And check out this Lancia Stratos. That thing is so cool. But get this, they have a first gen Lamborghini Gallardo front and center. This place is amazing. Have just incredible cars. This is the V12 Vanquish, the Tesla Roadster. I told you guys this is going to be a museum piece someday. Classic Maseratis, old Cobra over there. There's so many places to look. We have the Porsche 918 Spider. This, of course, has the Weissach pack. We have the Alfa Romeo Giulietta Spider. Behind it is the 8C. This place is spectacular. The Lamborghini Miura S. We can get a look at that first floor, the 330 GTO. The Miura revolutionized not only Lamborghini, but the automotive industry as well. And this is widely considered the first modern supercar. And just check out some of these classic Porsches. We have the Mercedes 300 SL Roadster. Beautiful, beautiful car. This place is quite impressive. Get a look at the front of that 300 SL. If you look down there, you can see the front end of the LaFerrari. And of course, this is the 300 SL Gullwing. Beautiful, beautiful car. Pretty cool to see the coupe and the Roadster back to back. Then we have the GT3 RS. This place is amazing. Check out this Vector, the V8 twin turbo. Some pretty crazy concept cars back there as well. There's only 17 Vectors in the world. Look at this thing. What in the world is that? This thing is crazy. Look at that interior. Check out this Vector, the V8 twin turbo. Some pretty crazy concept cars back there as well. There's only this thing is
can help a lot. Something that is very
good infrastructure. And then highways, we have cars, and cars are driven by people who are licensed to drive. Professor Alexandra made a comparison and potential area for
everything here. This is just as well. There's only this thing is
can help a lot. Something that is very
good infrastructure. And then highways, we have cars, and cars are driven by people who are licensed to drive. Professor Alexandra made a comparison and potential area for
everything here. This is just as well. There's only this thing is
can help a lot. Something that is very
good infrastructure. And then highways, we have cars, and cars are driven by people who are licensed to drive. Professor Alexandra made a comparison and potential area for
everything here. This is just as well. There's only
at the household level. Today, at a adult population level, 75 to 80% of adult population has a bank account. At a household level, almost 99.9%, and that's universal financial inclusion. But that's from a banking perspective, just having access to a bank account. We're working on credit and other things as we go along. The payments revolution, I've talked about it. It's the most open payments platform that has now been able to integrate all banks. You can make payment from X bank to Y bank, from a wallet to a merchant at zero friction, at zero cost. And see the volumes. The volumes have gone through the roof. I mean, 2.8 billion in June. The latest numbers for August and September and October are $4.5 billion, 4.5 billion transactions. So if you see the curve is just going up and up. It's more than a hockey stick curve that is called in the private startup world. So, and it works as on the lowest phone, on a non-smartphone, to the smartest of phones. And Google Pay works on top of UPI, WhatsApp works on top of UPI, everything works on top of UPI. And this is a great example of an open system where anybody can come on top and the value gets created. And this is a great example that I wanted to talk about, is about, you know, the from an economic benefit, that the time and money wasted in onboarding and doing KYC checks and has really drastically reduced from an average of $25, $30 to $1, and days have compressed. So that really brings efficiency into the system. Professor and my co-panelists and the listeners and participants in the conference, this is the story of building public platform. This is the only billion user platform in the world which is not owned by a private company. And when you create public platforms and cooperate, what it does is it creates innovation all across, from businesses to startups to governments. The government of India itself has saved more than $20 billion implementing this platform, and the cost of implementing this platform has been less than $2 billion. Let alone all the intangible benefits of tax savings and better tax collections and auditability of transactions and other things. Just by doing direct transfers, removing fakes and ghosts from the system, the direct benefits transfer scheme of the government has really saved $22 billion in the first few years itself. So systems like this pay for themselves, also bring about multiple $100 billion companies, $10 billion companies, and multiple unicorns that are getting listed in the stock exchanges, are all thanks to the payments platform, the KYC platforms. What are we doing for the future? Somebody talked about agriculture. So we have the health stack being made, we have the credit stack being built, the travel stack, voice, so that the people who are left behind in the digital evolution don't get left behind. They can do voice-based commands, and all the 22 languages are going to be available as an open platform. And lastly, I do want to talk about what the Indian Prime Minister has already made it available to all countries in the world, is our vaccine platform. Again, it's a great example of an open public platform. You can, very conveniently book vaccines, book your slots, get your certificate, and it works on top of, it's an open platform. So it works on top of WhatsApp. I can just WhatsApp, for example, download my certificate or book an appointment, and it will do it for me. So, this is how we have, India has taken the approach to solving the tough questions of the digital economy. With public platforms comes more trust, more value creation, lesser issues of privacy, more transparency, better governance, and lesser, the last point is very important, that you really break the monopolies that exist of the private platforms on many of the domains. So finally, Professor, within time, is that we, the lessons from the India journey have been mobile first, being able to do regional languages, doing assisted transactions, very agile policy making. We can have a full session on policy making itself. Make sure that there is inclusion at all levels, open platforms, and indigenously made platforms. With that, thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry if I rushed up a little bit, but I wanted to make sure I'm within time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gupta, for a very wonderful illustration of India's progress towards digitalization. As you rightly indicated, the bottom-up approach, I think, although we have seen some evidences from Brazil and some other countries, India has actually provided some kind of a very formal structure for digitalization in that sense. And many of these public platforms are actually adding quite a lot of value. Actually, one of the theoretical innate of the contribution of digital economy is to enhance the value in terms of production and distribution. And there are plenty of examples from India, which has actually piloted many programs and contributed towards this agenda. But I think, once again, thank you very much for us to understand the DNA of India's digitalization in a very short span of time, and I really hope that we will have more time for discussion later on. Let me invite our third panelist, Kesom Masilli, and I'm sure working in UN, she has a global vision or global approach towards the issue. It's for you. Thank you.
Namaskar and greetings to the organizers, the Government of India and RIS, and the eminent speakers and participants. It's a pleasure to be here today speaking about the digital economy from the perspective of a development and inclusion perspective. At the UN, and specifically as the UN Development Program, we believe that the development of digital economies is a fundamental force for change in this century. It's reshaping economies, it's reshaping government and service delivery, as well as governance and all the civil society, and community engagement. Therefore, it's impacting every aspect of development and our lives. And this has profound consequences and exponential pace of the digital transformation, which demands global leadership that we are here to speak about, as well as the local action to really reimagine how development is done in a digital age. And in many ways, the very powerful digital technologies, they represent, as we've just heard from Mr. Gupta, an tremendous opportunity to accelerate the progress towards the sustainable development goals. Most governments globally, they are rapidly increasing their use of digital technologies, creating opportunities to deliver more responsive, efficient, cost-saving services to citizens, including those that have been previously excluded or marginalized, such as women. Countries that have developed digital infrastructure, such as payments and identification systems like India, they've responded more effectively to the COVID-19 pandemic than countries whose digital infrastructures are less developed. And businesses and jobs are also changing. We've seen that in 26 advanced and emerging economies, they are rapidly digitizing the working processes. And it's also linked to greater economic resilience. So in many ways, in the most highly connected economies, digital infrastructure ends up mitigating more than half of the long-term negative economic impact that we normally have seen previously in crises, including in this crisis of COVID-19. So we know that the opportunities are tremendous, as we've heard from everyone, but we also know that the promise of the digital economy brings real and growing challenges, especially to close the digital divide, especially for women, especially for the marginalized population segments. In some of the low-income countries, 70% of the households are not yet covered by broadband networks. 33% are out of reach of mobile internet. 234 million fewer women than men use mobile internet, with women 15% less likely to own a smartphone. So new challenges continue to arise as in a digital economy, data privacy, cybercrime, and disinformation starts proliferating. So we know that the national policy and regulatory frameworks that are being implemented have often been reactive, uncertain, and piecemeal. And finally, the rapid and pervasive change that we are seeing can be disruptive, can strain the limited capacity of many governments, where we need to invest in more skill building, in more digital public infrastructure to respond more effectively. So really, I believe that as the digital economy takes many turns, and as Dr. Arun, you had mentioned, there's no start or end to this progress of the growing digital economy. I believe that it's vital that our approach as leaders must remain rooted in clear principles that are based on experiences, on international frameworks that put people and the planet first. And at UNDP, we uphold the guiding principles of rights, of access, of empowerment, and opportunity, particularly for the marginalized population. And some of these principles are promoting people-centered, inclusive approaches that leave no one behind, because we know that when digital transformation, digital economy development is designed around people, as we heard from Mr. Gupta as well, when it's designed around people, when it reflects the unique and diverse development context that will safeguard human rights, including those that are excluded previously, then we can really close the digital divide. We also know that as digital technologies evolve to not just enable better access to public services, but increasingly mediate access to everything from healthcare to employment to education to participation in the culture and social life, we must take a much more expansive view of human rights in digital development. Thirdly, we must advocate for open standards in digital to unlock scale, reusability, and interoperability, not just within one nation, but across the region, across the globe. And really, to achieve that, we must strengthen our local digital ecosystem. We must work not just with the digital innovators, but also with the civil society and the community groups to ensure that digital is sustainable and accountable and it's right-based. And lastly, the strategic partnerships that we can develop to ensure that adequate resources are being put in the right places to safeguard and protect the people and the planet. I also had the privilege to lead the UN's Principles for Responsible Digital Payments, which was led with the significant contribution of the Government of India. And really, as Mr. Gupta had said, in a digital economy, India has clearly led the way. And there are 4 ways in which India has demonstrated leadership, which I believe if we see more across the world, we would really see digital economies being much more inclusive. Identity is being democratized, privacy is getting democratized, data is democratizing, payments are democratizing through UPI and Aadhaar-enabled payments. So really through a principle-based approach for the common people, the Government of India and many other leaders that are joining forces now to develop digital public goods at scale, we can really foster responsible innovation and adoption of technology in digital economies that brings greater inclusive growth, as well as puts very strong frameworks for safeguards and privacy, engaging the community and the civil society at large. And therefore, I believe that the opportunity ahead of us as a global community that's gathered here is to close the remaining digital divide, really focusing on the last mile across the various geographies, across the various BRIC nations, and wherever the BRIC nations are providing leadership support. And really, in a digital economy, services must work each time. They should be fair, they should be transparent, and they should be accountable. And most importantly, they should offer recourse when they fail in these responsibilities. So with this, thank you so much for allowing me this time, and very glad to be here among the eminent panelists and speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Masili, for a very thought-provoking presentation on how development is done in a digital age, because there are quite a lot of issues on right, access, and empowerment, and also the division, particularly among the people who live in distanced areas, and also the marginalized population. So that's a very genuine need. I remember a discussion we had on ICTs in 1990s. At that time, one of the main point of debate was at that time about ICT and the digital divide. But over the period of time, ICTs have actually neutralized in terms of its impact and division. And now we have a new technology, the digital technology. The issue of digital divide has come up. So how did we address the issue of ICT at that point of time? And all the governments, they enhanced the technological frames. That's the one way. And then the development of right and appropriate reflective policies to address that one. So I wonder whether now when we look into the digital technologies, and particularly from 2007 onwards, it has created huge impact on the various sectors. But still, if you look into the performance of digital technology among the BRIC countries, we see that some countries are actually doing in a systematic manner and moving up, but others are actually, there is a learning gap in terms of identifying the right strategies for them. So what is the real problem here? Is it a problem of vision, or is it a problem of understanding the digital technology, what it is for, or people normally think the digital technology means mainly for enhancing the financial sector productivity and issues like that. Of course, they are very important, but at the same time, impact on society is also equally important. So I just want to hear your views on this, and also considering your vast experience in different countries, and how do you see that this kind of gap and how we can address this gap in the coming years in a much more speedier manner than the normal organic way to address this issue. So let me ask this question to Dr. Moroskida first. And yeah, please, floor is for it.
Thank you, Professor Aaron. Well, I would say that the comprehensive policy measures and the strategy is extremely important. That's actually what I wanted to say in my presentation, but didn't want to make it too long. We must remember the 3 levels of digital inequality. The first level is access, infrastructure, and so on. The second level is the capabilities of the people, and that is digital literacy, how they can use this digital technology. It's not enough just to have a Wi-Fi point and at each of the villages and so on, to have the wire up to each town or each house. And the third level is the creation of content to use so that people have some incentives to use. For example, to look at the jobs in the internet or to buy something in the internet. So this is the third level, and we must address all the levels simultaneously. If we first have infrastructure, then there is a lagging behind of some regions and social stratas that do not have capabilities to use that infrastructure. So I think that the gap depends on the levels of addressing this issue. If some countries are focusing only on infrastructure, then there will be a persistent gap because there are still people that find no useful content in the internet or no capabilities to use it. So we must address this issue on all 3 levels. A Russian digital economy national project is a good example because we have measures embodied there on all 3 levels. We addressed directly the digital literacy issue. We addressed directly the e-government services and education issues. And we are creating a platform for the universal platform for jobs and so on, so that the people can professionally realize them and find a suitable job for them. So I believe that this is an issue of comprehensive strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moroskida. That is very interesting because the current global paradigm is connectivity brings growth in the case of physical infrastructure. But what we are discussing here is in the case of digital infrastructure, although the connectivity is there, we need something more than that, beyond that, in terms of bringing the required growth. That's very interesting.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gupta, do you have any views on this issue?
Well, I think comprehensive strategy is the most important thing, and as all of us are agreeing, there are 3 layers to it, the 3 levels to it: to the connectivity, the literacy, access to devices, and then of course the content, which is the destinations. And in that, the creating public infrastructure is very, very important. As we go with a lot more digitization and a lot more people, the cost, for example, is coming so low. There is something called the Moore's law, and that has been broken. So what we are seeing is the cost of devices really becoming low. The cost of access. India has, for example, the cost of access from $4 per GB of data is now down to 10 cents. That's a 40 times reduction in cost of data. And similarly, the hardware has come down. I think the key things will be how well can you make it more inclusive, diversified, all the technologies, platforms, making it voice enabled, so that people who have become digitally not literate but digitally are using digital technology but are not alphabetically literate can use it, and definitely skilling will play a very important role in it. Professor has already talked about the PMG DISA program, and everybody will need to do skilling. But the skilling will need to move also beyond just the skilling to how to use, but how to use to get more jobs, better skills for yourself, and really employment and efficiency. So I think this is an ever-growing field. The good news here is the leapfrogging. Nations who have missed out on certain technologies or certain waves are not really far behind. It's the catch-up is not going to be 30 years. The catch-up is probably 2 to 3 years. So that's the good news, and that's what we should take hope from. And every nation, every country, every continent can catch up very fast.
Mr. Gupta, I think it's quite interesting to note that the duration of limited catch-up period with this technology compared to the previous technologies. Let me get the final views from Ms. Maselli about it, because I think you have this wide experience from a UN perspective. So in terms of incentives at one end, and also the instruments and the development of technology in terms of user-friendly interfaces, I still feel that gap is quite overwhelming across the regions and continents and countries. So what is your take on that? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. And I absolutely agree with you and all the other panelists. You had asked, is it lack of vision? I think on vision, most countries have it. We've seen that, but it's translating that vision and then the unequal capacities that exist in countries, which, sometimes act as key determinants in terms of the pace of that journey towards an inclusive digital economy. Second, oftentimes, digital economy transformation is part of one government department or ministry, whereas really to succeed in creating inclusive digital economies, we must take a whole of government approach, which India has done very successfully, which many countries are leaning on as well. But we still need to really create that cooperation across different functions of the government that have for centuries existed as disparate functions. So that level of technical and policy level cooperation is another key determinant. The third aspect, I believe, is to what extent do we really leverage the technical skills available in the respective countries, or even are able to access it to advise and inform the implementation of the digital economy transformation, which again is with that, of course, comes then government's own capacities and countries' own capacities, which again is, I would say, the third key determinant in terms of what sets the pace, the inclusion of digital economies worldwide. In terms of the geographical differences, absolutely. I mean, and each country is shaped by their own unique history and contexts. But we do see cooperation happening at a rapid pace. We do see countries like India and the Brics country leading on that cooperation. And from the UN side, we believe that there's a lot of technology and knowledge transfer that can be accelerated, across the regions, across countries, and we are quite poised to play an enabling role in making sure that that happens in partnership, of course, with the member states. And lastly, I think when we talked about ICT many years ago, it was about just digital technologies, digital solutions. But I think in digital economy, it's about how the governance frameworks are continue to evolve and intersect, and are built with the right kind of safeguards to protect people and their rights. It's also about how the community is engaging both in terms of innovation and building on top of it, as well as the last mile community who connects so many of the dots in terms of delivery of services, in terms of the critical role they play in building trust and conveying trust of digital economy to the last mile. So I believe these are two very critical components that have to go hand in hand with any digital economy transformation, governance frameworks and community engagement, which will then, along with the digital technologies, really ensure the inclusive success of this transformation.
Thank you, Masali, for that discussion on critical components and also the challenges where we can roll out the digital technology across the world. So we don't have much time. We are actually 3 minutes late. So since I haven't seen many questions in the chat box, I think it's time to conclude the session. But how can I thank my panelists, such a brilliant panel with wealth of experience, the vast wealth of experience. And thank you again, Dr. Moroskida, Mr. Gupta, and also Ms. Masali. And your views really enriched the session. And I hope when India is taking over the Brics presidency soon, I think they can pursue some of this digital agenda in the coming years. Once again, thank you very much for the panelists and also to listeners. And thank you, RIS, for taking initiative in organizing such a wonderful conclave. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Arun. You not only maintained time, but all of you could manage to cover as many issues as possible in the digitalization and development space. So thank you so much, and all our eminent panelists will be in touch with you later on also. Now it's the time to move to the, please stay back for the concluding session. We are now moving to the valedictory session. As per the agenda, we have President of NDB to give the valedictory address. Unfortunately, there was an urgent meeting, so President could not avoid that meeting. Sorry, but his office has shared his message in terms of a recorded speech. So I would now request our IT department to please share the video with all of you.
Hello, this is Marcos Trujillo. I'm president of the New Development Bank, and it's a great honor for me to join this Brics Virtual Economic Conclave on Reshaping Global Economic Cooperation. And I wanted to acknowledge and congratulate India's Ministry of Finance, the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, the Reserve Bank of India. It is indeed a very important conference that's taking place in a very challenging international environment. I think it would be fair to say that a way of characterizing the global juncture is that we are perhaps experiencing a kind of evolution of globalization. Globalization has a number of characteristics that remain the same for a certain period of time, but then they evolve, they change. And I think it's very important for the Brics to understand what are these structural forces in place that are changing globalization, that are making globalization evolve, because it's within this framework that economic cooperation can be the most efficient and the most fruitful. I think one of the chief characteristics of this evolution of globalization that we are experiencing today, and of course there's a lot of talk about short-term challenges and debt, but there's something there that truly represents a tectonic shift in terms of global economic relative power. Because in this year of 2021, if you take into account the so-called G7, so the traditional industrial economies of the world that have been grouping for over 30 years under this G7 format. So we're talking about the United States, Japan, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Italy. They have a combined gross domestic product measured at purchasing power parity terms for 2021 of about $42 trillion. Whereas if you take into account what I call the E7, the big emerging 7 economies of the world. So China, India, Russia, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, they will close 2021 with a gross domestic product, once again, measured at purchasing power parity terms, of $53 trillion. So that is a very important comparison in terms of how the emerging economies have a bigger and bigger slice of the pie. Even if you take the BRICS alone, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, BRICS has already a bigger GDP, PPP, than the G7. So that's, I think, key because it points to a certain trend in terms of not only the flows of trade, but also in terms of investment. I am from Brazil originally. Today, in 2021, Brazil does more business, has more exports to India than it does to the UK. Brazil has more exports to a country like Bangladesh than it does to Denmark, Norway, Australia, and Israel combined. And I think that comes to the second point of what I like to see as an evolution of globalization, which is we are also witnessing a kind of rerouting of global value chains. Some talk about global supply chains. I think it's a much more comprehensive phenomenon. It includes supply chains, of course, but it includes also the flows of foreign direct investment. It includes new avenues for trade. It includes the possibility of new trade-enabling infrastructure. It includes the new flows of research, development, and innovation, and also marketing activity. So that traditional international division of labor that we have grown used to seems to be in a process of evolution as well. And I think, once again, more and more emerging economies will have a bigger slice of the pie. Some say that this is being driven by geopolitics. And here I don't want to downplay the role of geopolitics. Geopolitics is indeed important. But I understand that this is not the most important reason why global value chains are being rerouted. Other reasons are actually more determinant in redirecting those flows. So, for example, trade and investment agreements that are not only about tariffs and quota, but that are also about standards. For example, standards in terms of intellectual property rights, standards in terms of environmental policy, rules of origin, standards in terms of how the government goes about procurement. So the way in which countries will group themselves, organize themselves around these, along these standards will also be a very important factor driving how the flows of prosperity will be determined in the next couple of years. And of course, here another very important aspect in rerouting is some of the big players in a global economy, like China, are no longer a low-cost country. A country like China is experiencing a shift towards the service sector. It's becoming more of a tech-intensive society. This is also true about other BRICS, particularly when it comes to India's industry of software. So there's more and more value addition that will also impact the way global value chains are being rerouted. And then there's a third characteristic that I wanted to share with you of this evolution of globalization that I like to refer to as the metamorphosis of infrastructure, the metamorphosis of infrastructure. So traditionally, we used to think about physical infrastructure and technological infrastructure as a different sector. And I think what this, with COVID or post-COVID world is showing us is that there is a kind of fusion, a marriage between physical infrastructure and tech-intensive infrastructure, even when it comes to areas like education or health, when we talk about social infrastructure. For example, we can no longer think of education simply as having the school building set up. It has to be the school building that is equipped with Wi-Fi towers and tablets that will allow children to have some kind of distance education in the event that in-person classes are not taking place. Or, for example, the technology that connects different health units in order to issue a kind of early warning to prevent the spread of an upcoming pandemic. So once again, the technological element, this tech-intensive layer will be more and more present in the way we think about infrastructure. So technology here should be seen as an across-the-board horizontal characteristic. It doesn't have to be state-of-the-art technology. Sometimes the innovation infrastructure will be in how you combine the traditional and the technological, not necessarily having the latest technology, but making sure that this tech-intensive element is there whenever you think about infrastructure is something that will also mark this evolution of infrastructure, this metamorphosis of infrastructure. And I think these three key points are extremely relevant for the Brics, because the Brics, as we all know, 20 years ago, when it was first thought of as a concept by Jim O'Neill, represented how the global economy would look like in 2030, 2040, 2050. And indeed, the Brics are, as I mentioned, taking a bigger and bigger portion of global GDP. So, but that is what I call Brics 1.0. So Brics is the future of the global economy, Brics 1.0. But we know that the heads of government, the heads of state of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa decided to gather and to organize a series of consensus building meetings at the levels of heads of state, at the Ministry of Finance, Ministers of Development. Today, we talk about Brics 2.0, which is this process of building consensus and sometimes of building institutions as well. And by the way, here, I think the Brics have accomplished much more than the G7, because the G7 have been meeting, as I said, for over 3 decades, and they never came up with institutions of their own. Whereas in the case of Brics, we have the contingency reserve arrangement, and most importantly, we have the new development bank to provide for infrastructure and sustainable development, a very important platform. And to think about the new development bank that 6, 7 years ago, it only existed as a dream or on paper. And now we're talking about a fully operational financial institution with a project portfolio of $30 billion of approvals in health, in sanitation, water, transport, social infrastructure, mobility, urban mobility, smart cities. So it's a truly remarkable accomplishment, what has happened since the creation of the new development bank. And the figures in itself are important, $30 billion of project approvals, along 6.5 years since the bank came into operation, but also the development impact that it generates. For example, if we were to stretch in a straight line all the roads that the new development bank is helping to either build or upgrade, it would be possible to travel across the entire diameter of planet Earth. And here, I think the new development bank plays another very important role, because we were talking about, as I mentioned, some of the biggest emerging economies of the world. These are different countries. They have, of course, many similarities, many commonalities. It's a big territory, big population. They are very important players in their regions and throughout the world. But they also have many differences. But although they might have different characteristics, if you're looking at one specific or another profile, it is true that when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to sustainable development, these countries come together at the new development bank and they work in this joint efforts to provide more capital for long-term financing, and also for finding those solutions that best fit the development needs of their populations. So that is why I'm extremely positive, very optimistic about the future of Brics. as a platform for economic cooperation, as a framework for building consensus, and as also a platform in which our countries can promote institutional development through the new development bank, because we are committed here to being new every day, being able to respond to this ever-evolving challenges of development that are changing rapidly in the context of the fourth industrial revolution. So we have to apply 21st century solutions to 20th century problems, but also have an eye towards the future of infrastructure, the future of sustainable development. And that is what we're trying to accomplish here at the new development bank. So once again, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to having many opportunities to cooperate here from the new development bank. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for a very illuminating speech. As you expressed optimism in the Brics process, the same was deliberated in the last 2 days. We could see that all our eminent panelists highlighted the same issues in a very different way, that there is a lot of scope for Brics to explore, even though a lot has been achieved. As per the plan, I would make a summary of some of the proceedings, but not necessarily the final set of recommendations, but just to refresh our memory in the last 2 days. Just highlight the points discussed in the last 4 sessions, technical sessions, and by our keynote speakers, the chairs, and the eminent personalities. So we began our discussion with a note that Brics has moved far ahead of just being an acronym to an institution. And this was just now highlighted by Dr. Troizo, President of NDB. That it's no longer an acronym, it's a reality. It has become an institution which can deliver public goods to the larger society, the global society. So we began with a very confident and convincing remarks by the Brics Sherpa of India, who recently steered the Brics chairship of India. The achievements were magnificent, and he highlighted certain things which I would like to refresh your memory. He said that at this juncture, we have achieved a lot in terms of and we are all still grappling with the issues of reforms in the structures. Reforms in the structures of the multilateral institutions within Brics, and then how the Brics process could be consolidated so that we take what we achieved to sustain over the next few years. He highlighted a couple of say achievements of the Brics India chairship in terms of the strengthening the economic cooperation in the financial sector, trade policy, science, technology, innovation, and then there is a need for more thinking in capital and finance. And more than that, he provided the larger perspective for the next chairs to carry forward. Then we had very substantive inaugural address by Chief Economic Advisor of India. He highlighted that how Brics countries are important players in the post-COVID economic recovery, and more specifically, he touched upon the specific policies undertaken by Government of India in terms of the success in the vaccination. The success in the vaccination restored confidence, and then India could open up in a gradual fashion, and the economy is bouncing back. And he highlighted certain policies that the stimulus packages were initially structured around Keynesian thinking, but later on making it more comprehensive with Atmanirbhar, production-linked incentives, and all these things. Then we moved to the technical session 1, which was on financial market development. So financial market development, as you know, it covers bond market, liquid market, forex market. So the scope for financial market development is all encompassing, and that is a dynamic process. So we had 3 very eminent panelists who touched upon there is a need of developing Brics currency union, promoting local currency instruments which would be which would be pivotal to promote local capital market development in general. And there are also reference to that how the mutual recognition of licenses, certificates, so basically harmonization of the practices as far as the financial market is concerned. So that could possibly drive the financial markets to in an integrated fashion. But the focus was on the local currency, local capital market development. Then we had a very enriching session on innovation. And this innovation session, we had a very reputed scholars from these countries. They emphasize certain points very upfront, and there is a need of developing innovation capabilities in the Brics countries and in fact, all developing countries. So there has to be innovation system, which is organic, which would go in an organic fashion, investing in productive capabilities, scope for technological upgradation, how to involve that, engage as a link it to the local economic development. And there is a need to shift from the sectoral innovations to an integrated innovation ecosystem. Also, there was a reference to special innovation systems. And then we had also in the part of the innovation, we had financial innovation. So Mr. Harish Natarajan from World Bank brought the perspective that Brics countries are at a very right stage of development, and financial innovation could possible if we enhance access to finance. Brics countries have experienced a lot of growth in that segment, but still, as per the global standards, we are at average in terms of the mobilization of savings and borrowings from financial institutions. And he highlighted some key areas of development in fintech, especially channeling innovation, highlighted the retail digital payment revolution happening across in India and other countries. Then we had Professor Eduardo from Brazil. He mentioned about that how innovation in a health sector could be possibly, and it referred to a theoretical paradigm that we don't have to treat innovation in a certain way. It has to be integrated approach towards innovation, and giving particular example from the health sector. He also highlighted that there is a need for looking back what is happening domestically, because whatever innovation happens domestically can be scaled up at a regional level. Then today, the first session was on green finance. As you know, green finance is not only sounds good, but it has a lot of apprehensions also in terms of understanding how it is different from conventional financing, whether the same set of prudential regulations and supervision apply to green finance as well or not. If not, then what are the futuristic thinking that is there in this sector? Professor Bishwajit Banerjee, we have a keynote address by Sir Danny Alexander. He brought such a rich experience from his own experience, both in AIIB and outside AIIB, in terms of how AIIB is moving towards complying and aligning all its projects by 2023, July 1st to the Paris agreements. And he highlighted certain specific examples. I don't have time, but we'll include in the conclave report. In general, there were 2-3 points mentioned that there is a need to develop local capital market, because green finance can be mobilized through certain new forms of instruments, blended finance instruments. So there is a need to develop local capital market and scale of finance. Finance is happening, but it needs to be scaled up given the magnitude of climate finance gap we have. Rajiv Mahajan brought the private sector perspective. He emphasized on there are barriers in green finance. The barriers may not be true, but this is actually perceived barriers. The perceived barriers in the sense that the high return ambitions of the investors may not be realized immediately. So that could be potential disincentive for them to not to explore these projects. So that there is a need for that. In fact, Sir Danny Alexander referred to that there is a need for de-risking of projects and then promoting innovation both in technology and in financial instruments. So Asian markets are catching up. He provided a very interesting set of numbers in terms of the ESG investments. It was 40 billion in 2015, and it is now 280 billion in 2020. So it's a seven-fold rise in the ESG investments, which are actually green finance flows. But still, there are a lot of policy issues to be resolved. The last session was on digital economy. As you know, digital economy is a new trigger for growth, innovation, and also creating new layers of divide. So our panelists touched upon both the opportunities in digital economy in terms of the benefits of the technology as such, in bringing efficiency in service delivery and bringing efficiency in financial inclusion, and also addressing the aspirations of the common people. But they also highlighted that there is a need for localization. Localization to minimize the digital divide, to link it to the specific levels of the development priorities of the countries. So these are some of the, I think there were one or two other points were there. The India's jam trinity, which is, I think, the first of its kind in the world, which brought revolution. It has contributed to the very immediate expectation of any ordinary citizen in a country, ease of living. It has helped people to live with ease, live with dignity, and live with access to richer information about the functioning of the government and the society. A lot of cost saving have happened, and the cost savings, hassle reduction in hassle, all these things are people-centered, inclusive approaches by Government of India, and it was also highlighted. But there is also a need for looking at the standards in data sharing, interoperability, and what type of local digital ecosystem we need so that we benefit from the innovations in digital technology and financial technology, that is fintech. So these are some of the broad points and recommendations from the floor, from the conclave. But as we are saying, from the organization side, we will bring a detailed conclave report shortly for your information and for public consumption. So with this, I end this part of my note on the sessions. Now I request, since my Director General is connected, if he has any views to share with the with our participants, it will be.
No, you have done a very good summary, Dash. So I don't need to have added anything. I think you have captured all the broad contours of our engagement within Brics. You have very rightly emphasized in the financial sector the idea of green finance, the idea of digital currency, the session that we have discussed, and you have very well captured all the broad points that have emerged across the observations from our Brics Sherpa Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, the CEA, the president of the NDB and the vice president of NDB, our professors and colleagues who were so ably representing various sort of perspectives. Professor Arun has identified our idea that was there with technology, society, and finance that are connecting in, on which we have already been talking about. So I think, Dash, you have captured the broad nuances quite well. And I think our colleagues from China, our colleagues from South Africa, Brazil, they all have identified from Russia various priority areas, Irina and Yo-Yo, and all have identified, Alexandra, so many important points which you have captured. I'm sure RIS would be issuing a summary and a document report out of this with Department of Economic Affairs and with Reserve Bank of India. So I think you have done a great job. Congratulations to the team RIS. And I would also thank DA and MEA for their participation. I would request my colleague, Dr. Amit Kumar, for vote of thanks. So Amit, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, sir. It's an honor and a privilege to extend the vote of thanks at the end of this extremely enriching two-day-long Brics economic conclave on a very relevant topic of exploring the role of Brics in reshaping global economic cooperation, organized jointly by RIS and RBI. We are extremely grateful to the Department of Economic Affairs and Ministry of Finance, Government of India, for guiding and partnering with RIS in organizing this important event. On behalf of my organization, let me start with extending our sincere thanks to India's Brics Sherpa, Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, for delivering an extremely insightful special remarks in the inaugural session yesterday, highlighting the key developments that happened within Brics this year and under India's chairship, and also suggesting way forward for enhanced cooperation. We convey our sincere gratitude to Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, for delivering a fascinating inaugural address yesterday, which in many ways actually set the tone for the ensuing discussions these last 2 days. We extend our sincere thanks to Mr. Marcus Trozo, President of the New Development Bank, for his extremely valuable and forward-looking valedictory address, which he delivered via video message just before 10 minutes before, pushing for greater cooperation among Brics member countries and by alluding to Brics 2.0. Special thanks to Sir Danny Alexander, Vice President AIIB, for delivering a much enriched and erudite keynote address this afternoon. We would also like to profusely thank all the chairs, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, Professor Lakhvinder Singh, Professor Sojit Banerjee, and Professor Thankum Arun for sharing their precise insights on the topic, as well as for steering their respective sessions in an excellent manner. We are also very grateful to all the distinguished panelists from all the Brics countries for their valuable remarks. Professor Yagrina, Irina, Professor Haihong, Professor Manmohan Agarwal, Professor Cruz, Mr. Harish Natarajan, Professor Eduardo, Dr. Carlos, Mr. Saurabh Ghosh, Mr. Rajiv Mahajan, Dr. Alexandra, Mr. Gupta, and Ms. Kezam Mazali. Thank you so much, all the speakers, for actively participating from various time zones of the world and sharing your extremely valuable insights and suggestions on the topic. This important dialogue would not have been possible without the constant valuable guidance and support which comes from our Director General, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. Thank you so much, sir, for all your kind guidance and encouragement, and also for setting the context of this conclave right at the beginning with your extremely rich welcome remarks yesterday. Sincere thanks also are due to my colleague, Dr. Priyadarshi Das, for his active engagement in organizing this grand event, and also for excellently presenting the key recommendations that emerged during the deliberations. Also, our thanks to Mr. Virinder Singh and Ms. Remya Prabha from DE and Ms. Smita Sharma from RBI for their kind cooperation and in coordinating this event. Many thanks to Ms. Siddhi Sharma and our IT and administration team too for all their support in ensuring that the event went off smoothly. Last but not the least, I would also like to thank all the participants for their gracious presence and in making this event successful. We look forward to continue this engagement in future. Once again, thank you all. Have a nice day.
Thank you all. And see you soon.
Thank you very much, and best regards to all of you. Be healthy and happy.
Thank you, Professor Irina. Thank you.
Successful. We look forward to continue this engagement in future. Once